Welcome to Johnny Carson Files. On this video, Red Skelton walks onto the Tonight Show stage, leaning slightly on a cane nobody has ever seen him use in public. And before Johnny Carson can even finish his greeting, Kaye rises from the audience, where he has been sitting, unannounced, for the entire broadcast. What Kaye is about to say has been waiting 19 years to be spoken, and it will leave every person in that studio, including Johnny Carson himself, in complete silence. But before we dive in, quick reminder, double-check that you're subscribed, since a lot of you think you already are and aren't. It's free, and it really helps the channel. Thank you for being here. The Tonight Show was recorded that afternoon in the winter of 1986 before a studio audience of roughly 300 people at NBC's Burbank studios. The broadcast set to air to nearly 18 million Americans later that night. Red Skelton had come on to promote a rare television special, his first major appearance in almost 2 years, and the audience's applause when he walked out carried an unmistakable current of relief beneath the enthusiasm, the sense of seeing someone beloved who had simply been away too long. Johnny Carson, who had known Red since the earliest days of his own career, greeted him with visible warmth. "Red," Johnny said, "it's been too long. How are you really doing?" Red Skelton settled into the guest chair slowly, favoring the cane in a way he tried to make look casual. "Johnny," he said, "I'm having the kind of year where you start counting the good days instead of the bad ones, and some months that number gets pretty small. But I figure as long as I can still make one person laugh, I've still got a job to do." Wait, do not miss this detail, because as Red Skelton finished that sentence, movement stirred in the audience, a figure rising from the third row that the cameras had not been directed to find, a face that took the studio a full 3 seconds to recognize, because nobody had any reason to expect him there at all. Johnny Carson's expression shifted from warm interview mode into genuine surprise. Red's own face, still turned partly toward Johnny, had not yet registered what was happening behind him. What you have seen so far is nothing compared to what happened next, because the man now walking down the aisle toward the stage was Kaye, and the story that would unfold over the following several minutes reached back 19 years, to a hospital corridor in 1967, and a debt of gratitude Kaye had been carrying in complete silence ever since. 1967 had been the hardest year of Kaye's life, though almost nobody outside his closest circle knew the full extent of it at the time. His only daughter, Dina, then in her early 20s, had been hospitalized with a severe respiratory illness that doctors initially struggled to diagnose, a frightening several weeks during which Danny had effectively suspended his entire career, canceling engagements, disappearing from public view, spending every possible hour at Cedars of Lebanon Hospital in Los Angeles. The press speculated wildly about his absence, some outlets suggesting professional trouble, others simply reporting that Kaye had become unreachable, and Danny, characteristically protective of his family's privacy, corrected none of it, preferring public confusion to any exposure of his daughter's fragile condition. The hospital staff on Dina's ward later remembered Kaye, not as the beloved entertainer millions of Americans knew from film and television, but simply as an exhausted, frightened father who had stopped performing any version of himself at all, sitting for hours in a hard plastic chair beside his daughter's bed, occasionally dozing upright, refusing every suggestion from staff that he go home and rest properly. A nurse named Gloria Petrakis, who would speak about the period only decades later after both Danny and Dina had given their blessing, recalled that Danny had grown almost unrecognizable across those weeks, his famous energy entirely drained away, replaced by a kind of hollowed, silent vigilance that she said was common among parents in that particular ward, but still somehow startling to witness in a man the world associated so completely with laughter. Red Skelton, who had known Danny Kaye for over 2 decades by that point through the tightly knit world of post-war entertainers, heard about the situation not from Danny directly, who told almost nobody, but from a mutual friend who mentioned it only in passing, assuming Red already knew. Red did not hesitate. He showed up at Cedars of Lebanon that same evening, uninvited and entirely unannounced, having told nobody at the studio where he was going, missing a rehearsal he was contractually required to attend, a decision that would later cost him a genuinely uncomfortable conversation with his own producers. He found Danny Kaye sitting alone in a hospital corridor at nearly midnight, still in the same clothes he had been wearing since early that morning, unshaven, hollow-eyed, staring at nothing in particular. Red sat down beside him without a word. He did not ask questions. He did not offer platitudes about hospitals or doctors or hope. He simply sat, and after nearly 20 minutes of silence, he reached into his jacket and produced a small harmonica he had apparently been carrying for exactly this kind of moment, and he played, very softly, so as not to disturb the quiet ward around them, a slow, unhurried version of a song Danny's own daughter had loved as a small child, a detail Red had somehow remembered from a conversation years earlier that even Danny himself had forgotten having. Danny Kaye later told only his wife, Sylvia, about what that quiet, unasked-for kindness had meant to him in that corridor, how something about the simple, undemanding presence of another person, someone who required nothing from him, expected no performance, needed no explanation, had allowed him to finally break down after weeks of forced composure, sobbing silently in a hospital hallway, while an old friend played harmonica beside him and said absolutely nothing at all. Dina Kaye recovered fully within another 10 days, and Danny returned to his career, his public life resuming, as though the crisis had never happened. But he never forgot that corridor, and in the 19 years that followed, he tried on several occasions to properly thank Red Skelton for it, always finding the moment somehow insufficient, the words never quite matching the size of what he was actually grateful for. Back in the Burbank studio, Danny Kaye reached the edge of the stage and stood there for a moment, waiting for Red Skelton to fully turn and see him. When Red did, his weathered face broke into an expression of pure, unguarded astonishment. "Danny," Red said, "what in the world are you doing here?" Danny Kaye walked closer, his own eyes already glistening. "I've been sitting in that audience for the last 20 minutes, Danny said, working up the nerve to do something I should have done 19 years ago. The studio audience, sensing something entirely unscripted unfolding in front of them, fell into an attentive hush. Ed McMahon set down his cue cards. Johnny Carson leaned back slightly, giving the two men space rather than inserting himself into a moment that clearly did not belong to the show's usual rhythm. A cameraman later said he had never seen the studio go quiet quite that fast, not even during the show's most dramatic scripted segments, as though the entire room had collectively understood, without anyone announcing it, that whatever was happening deserved a different kind of attention than the usual Tonight Show banter. 1967, Danny said, his voice unsteady. Cedars of Lebanon. Midnight in a hospital corridor. You remember that? Red Skelton's expression shifted from confusion into something quieter, more solemn. I remember, Red said softly. I never told anybody about that night, Danny continued. Not the press, not most of my own family. I've spent 19 years trying to figure out how to say thank you for something that big, and every time I tried, the words felt too small for what you actually did. The audience gasped as one sound, rippling backward through all 300 seats. Several people in the front rows were already reaching for tissues, sensing the weight of what was unfolding even without yet knowing the full story. You didn't ask me anything that night, Danny said. You didn't need me to explain. You just sat there and you played that harmonica, and somehow you knew exactly the song that would let me finally fall apart instead of holding everything together for one more hour. Red Skelton's own eyes had filled with tears, an expression rarely seen from a man whose public persona was built almost entirely around exuberant, boundless comedy. "I didn't do anything special," Red said quietly. "I just didn't want you sitting there alone. That was it. That was the whole plan. That was everything," Danny said. "That was exactly what I needed and had no way of asking for." Danny Kaye reached into his own jacket pocket and pulled out a small harmonica, worn and clearly old, holding it up for Red Skelton and the cameras to see. "I bought this the week after Dina recovered," Danny said. "Same model as yours. I've kept it in a drawer for 19 years, telling myself I'd learn to play it well enough to thank you properly someday. I never did learn. I'm not musical the way you are, but I wanted you to know I tried, because trying felt like the least I owed you." Red Skelton reached out and took the harmonica gently from Danny's hand, turning it over once before looking back up at his old friend. "You don't owe me anything," Red said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I'm honored you tried anyway." The two men embraced right there at the edge of the stage, 19 years of unspoken gratitude finally finding its way into a simple, wordless gesture that needed no further explanation. Johnny Carson, visibly moved, waited a long moment before speaking, allowing the two men the space the moment demanded. "Ladies and gentlemen," Johnny finally said, quietly, "I don't think any of us expected to see something like that today, and I don't think any of us will forget it either. If a story like this moves you even a little, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps these stories reach the people who need them. And I want to ask you something specific. Think of a kindness someone showed you once without asking anything in return. The kind that stayed with you far longer than they probably ever realized. And drop just one word describing it in the comments below, so we can see how many of us are still carrying gratitude like that." The Tonight Show ran 7 minutes over its scheduled time that evening, and NBC's switchboard stayed lit well past midnight, calls coming in from viewers who had their own version of a hospital corridor, their own unspoken debts of gratitude toward someone who had simply shown up without being asked. Letters arrived at NBC for weeks afterward, many describing small, undemanding acts of presence. A friend who sat quietly through a difficult night. A stranger who offered nothing but company when company was the only thing that actually helped. One letter, read aloud during an internal NBC staff meeting because it had moved half the room to tears, came from a widow in Ohio who wrote that her late husband had once done exactly what Red Skelton described, sitting beside her hospital bed for 6 straight hours after a difficult surgery without saying a single unnecessary word, and that she had never fully understood how to thank him for it until she watched 2 old entertainers demonstrate on national television that the thanking itself could simply be showing up again, 19 years later, harmonica in hand. Danny Kaye and Red Skelton remained close for the rest of their lives, speaking by phone almost every week regardless of where either man's touring schedule took him. Colleagues who worked with both men in their final years said the friendship had visibly deepened after that broadcast, as though something that had been carried privately for nearly 2 decades had finally been allowed to breathe in the open, changing the shape of how the two men related to each other from that point forward. Red Skelton kept the harmonica Danny gave him displayed in a small case in his home office for the remainder of his life, alongside his own original harmonica, the 2 instruments resting side by side as a quiet, permanent record of a debt that had finally, after 19 years, found its way into daylight. When Danny Kaye passed away in March of 1987, just over a year after that broadcast, Red Skelton gave a short statement to the press that captured in his characteristically simple way the entirety of what that friendship had meant. He said, "Some friends fill a room with noise. Danny filled mine with quiet, exactly when I needed it most, and I spent the rest of my life trying to return the favor." If this story moved you, think about the people who showed up for you without being asked, who offered presence instead of advice, silence instead of solutions, simply because they understood that sometimes that is the only thing that actually helps. Subscribe so you never miss these stories. And before you go, hit that like button if this one got you. It really does help. Then drop a comment and tell me, has someone ever shown up for you just to sit with you, without needing to say anything at all? Just tell us what happened. Let's remember them here together.